is the Vice President Europe at ICANN. For over 15 years in both the private and government sectors, he has been involved in international government and regulatory affairs. Now he is leading ICANN's strategic plan for outreach, support and engagement with governments, private sector, civil society and user groups throughout the region. As a private-public partnership, ICANN is dedicated to preserving the operational stability and is the regulator of namespaces of the Internet. He is a true digital leader, and we are excited to have him here with us. Please welcome Mr. Jacques Sahel.
I'm really glad to be here. Back in Luxembourg, I used to spend a lot of time here because I used to work for a small internet company that was sort of half Estonian, half Luxembourgish a few years ago. And I think so far today, I've really been inspired by the talks, but it's all been a bit too positive, I have to tell you. And again, if I think about my contacts in the past with governments from Luxembourg or Estonia, quite enlightened in comparison to the rest. And when we think about this topic today, we're supposed to talk about the status quo in digital governance. There's no real status quo. It's moving, and I'm not sure it's moving in the right direction. I don't mean to be gloomy. I simply mean to sort of remind ourselves of some of the challenges. And in fact, when I was listening to Jeremy earlier, I was really inspired by the call for us to be a bit more like children, as inspired and as curious as children and innovative as children. And I like that, and I wish that I will continue to have that sort of motto for the rest of my life. But it reminded me, listening to you, of a quote that was that's been attributed to Winston Churchill, and in internet circles, I don't know if you noticed, but there's a lot of Churchill quotes about. And I just checked on Wikipedia, and they say it might not be Churchill, might be Disraeli, might be a French guy. But anyway, the quote says, if at the age of 25 you're not a liberal, you have no heart. But at the age of 40, if you're not a conservative, you have no head. And so I think we have this sort of the thing we have to keep in mind when we start looking at charts like the inspiring Trump v. Clinton 18 to 25 years old stats. The guys who are 18 and girls who are 18 to 25 today might be wanting to vote for Clinton, but in 15 years' time they might be, crazy Trump supporters. That's just a potential reality. And when we think about governance and some of the decision makers out there today, they are in their 40s and more. So just that's sort of a bit of context. And so, sorry, that's a long introduction, and that wasn't the one I was planning to do today, but that's what caught me when I was listening to previous presentations, and that colors a little bit about this status quo or not of digital governance. And that's another illustration. That's an article from the 3rd of February, it's very recent, from Politico EU, which is one of the main regulatory sort of policy publications based out of Brussels, the sort of stuff that members of the European Parliament read every day. They have regular alerts. And that was a headline: Army of light bulbs, cameras poised to attack defenseless EU. So that obviously has got a bit of a sense of humor in it. But this is the detail. This is about the Mirai botnet last year, which basically affected all sorts of IoT devices. And here, yeah, the article was a bit funny. Or at least the title was a bit funny. But still, when you look at the detail, I think, all those companies, they're not regulated. And then you'll get to the vast majority of articles that are read by the political decision makers, by the parliamentarians, by the people that are making laws today and will be making more and more laws today that will, and in the future, that will affect the whole of the digital industry, including that Industry 4.0, which is basically every company that actually wants to get into the 21st century. They are inspired, they are informed by these sorts of titles. And arguably, you could say that's the sort of titles that we're not finding just in the press that's directed at politicians and policymakers. Unfortunately, I think this sort of feeling around the internet is bleeding into a lot of the mainstream media and therefore into public opinion. And that's the kind of context. that I want you to think about. Now, I was asked to talk about digital governance, and there's various definitions about internet governance. Oh, sorry, digital governance. In the corporate world, there's a nice trend in a way that there's more and more talk about digital governance in the sense of the governance, the operation of an organization's digital presence in the broad sense, not just a company's social media, websites, etc., but rather really how it harnesses the power of digital across the technologies it uses, the products, the processes, and its strategy generally, how it embraces the digital world. Part of that is called also sometimes digital governance. A small pillar of digital governance is also known as digital governance or internet governance, and it's very much to do with the regulatory stuff, the political context. And I think, unfortunately, more and more of us, and probably all of us in this room, have to pay much more attention to it than before. I still go to conferences where, especially I hear from some of the startups, I don't really worry too much about regulation. It's not going to touch us. No, it is. Or at least it's got a massive potential to touch all of us. And so I'll just mention a definition of well, so I didn't find a real good definition of digital governance, but I'll mention there's a definition of internet governance that the UN came up with. It's quite broad, describes all sorts of things, principles, norms, rules, etc. Basically, that's the norms that are set around the internet technologies, and in particular, internet uses. It's the norms, basically, the rules of the road, if you want. You can take it in a positive or in a negative way. It's our environment as a digital sector, and that's increasingly colored by the sort of news that people read, and in particular the political and regulatory decision makers. There's obviously the rise of cyber. I mean, it's been coming for years. It just keeps on increasing and keeps on adding to the economic cost and to an extent social cost, and going into the tens of billions and more per country, I'm talking. There's the rise of trolling. State hacking, you referred to it. Estonia was one of the first to be touched at massive scale. Now, at least some reports believe that it's happening more and more in a number of countries. You've got all sorts of other things. There's, I'm just talking about the internet here, people calling for much more protectionist measures to stop the influence of the big American internet companies which are coming in and taking our jobs and taking our economies and wiping our culture away. And it goes on like this. There's even in the UK, which is normally a tech-friendly place. A few years ago, there were street riots where the rioters were coordinating using BlackBerry Messenger, that high of technology and innovation that is BlackBerry. And the Prime Minister reacted at the time, former Prime Minister now, and said, we need a kill switch for the internet. We need to be able to stop all internet communication right now. Now, he had to turn around 24 hours later and explain, no, I didn't mean that. Okay. But that's the sort of noises that we hear, even from the most liberal, most innovation-friendly countries. And then you have all sorts of debates. We've heard it earlier. Jeremy was talking about it. It's true in Europe, and I don't think it's just in Europe. We hear, ooh, scary data. I think that's the expression he used. It's true. And unfortunately, or fortunately, not all children are like those that we saw in the video earlier. They are not all living around Berkeley in a lovely Californian type mentality where Alexa and opening doors with just a voice is normal. People do have different considerations, different cultural attitudes, and they're going to take time to change. So you add these sorts of different cultural approaches, cultural traditions, with the sort of news that we hear about, privacy versus security, all these dilemmas. You know, is encryption good because it protects your privacy, or is encryption bad because it enables terrorists to communicate? And so all these noises, that's what the public opinion is subjected to, and that's what the decision makers at political level are subjected to. And when they consider laws, that's the sort of stuff they have in mind. And this is not just about headlines. This is real. So even, I think generally, some people could say that might be a bit too negative, but the internet is under attack, right? We're not in a good space here as the digital industry in the broad sense. there's a lot of clouds, certainly above us, and not clouds in the good big data sort of meaning of it, of the word. In reality, let's look at it. Here in the EU, for the first time, we've got proposals from the European Union for a whole big initiative dealing with digital issues called the Digital Single Market. And that's great, because it's the first time that they tried to have a united, coherent, consistent policy to address all the stuff to do with digital issues and the internet. So that's a great thing. But what it means in practice is that actually there's over a dozen proposals for legislation in this area. So we're looking at major changes around, for instance, the regulation of so-called over-the-top services. People talk about WhatsApp and Skype, but obviously behind the big names, it's dozens and dozens of companies that could all of a sudden be regulated. You've got proposals to change so-called intermediary liabilities, vast changes in the laws of e-commerce, copyright, privacy. There's more on privacy. There's always more on privacy, more on security that's coming. There's a really long list. I don't want to bore you with it, but I could go through it with you if you want. There's a lot. There's thousands of pages of proposals. The laws of cross-border consumer contracts, the laws of consumer protection generally. Basically, all the relationships between a user and an online company, that's all up in the air now. And the process to review and to agree those legislative proposals is very much happening now. And in fact, a lot of these proposals should be negotiated when Estonia has got a presidency of the EU in the next, in the second semester of this year. It's probably going to last beyond that as well, but some of them will happen. So this is happening now. So this is not just about headlines. This is about legislation that is being negotiated between Brussels, Strasbourg, and Luxembourg at the moment here in the EU. And we see moves like that elsewhere in the world. In fact, it happens also in Europe, but elsewhere in the world, we see things that are probably even more worrisome. We hear about the great stuff that Estonia and Finland are doing with, for instance, sharing e-health data, stuff that's going to really help people. Yet, all over the world, including in Europe, we have a lot of demands for data localization. Basically, things that are going to completely negate the cloud or even the internet as such. No. You have data, you have to store it here in our country. The fact that the internet is all about cross-border, who cares? I want to protect my citizens. Protecting my citizens also might give me the opportunity to put in place measures to have access to that data to combat criminal threats or other. Again, this dilemma of privacy versus security. So you've got a lot of increasing pressure on digital companies to give access to consumers' data to law enforcement. That in itself is in conflict with privacy laws, and there's a sort of maelstrom going on. You have internet shutdowns because governments are becoming increasingly worried about all these uses of the internet that are happening, this social media that might destabilize their control. So all that, in summary, is that we've got a fairly negative mindset around and sort of discourse about the internet and digital world in general, not just in Europe, but I think really, frankly, around the world. And I think it's getting there in the US as well. Even though the US traditionally has been one of the places where people were probably most positive about the internet and the digital world. We've seen, especially with the sort of political developments, people talking about fake news, about potential state hacking, etc., manipulation generally, that even there's a whole current of negativity around the internet. So we need to pay attention. And I think as a digital world, we need to know, and I think any companies involved in digital needs to be at the very least aware of these issues of digital governance. And I would argue very much for these companies to build this, watch this into their strategies, into their future business plans. Because if you don't pay attention now, your business could suffer. So if you do want to have an impact on digital governance, what can you do? Where are the centers of powers? Well, I forgot to say one thing, of course, with all this mindset, this opinion, even if you forget about the regulations, what's happening even more than in the last 15 years is an erosion of trust from users and citizens, and that's probably even more worrisome. So let's go back to governance. You have three layers typically in digital governance that to consider. The infrastructure layer, the pipes, the spectrum, etc. Here, a lot of the centers of power are really standards-making bodies, things like the IEEE, maybe the ITU, GSMA, all sorts of fora. Different ways of participating depending on the type of companies that you are. Then you have the code or logical layer. So what is the internet? The internet is a network of networks, 60 to 70,000 networks. They've got this infrastructure, you know, together, whether they're internet service providers, big telcos, or, for instance, big universities with their own networks, or the likes of HP or Intel have a big network footprint. They come together using mainly things like the internet protocol to form the internet. And this glue that brings together this network to make up the internet is coordinated at this code or logical layer. This is what ICANN is, along with other organizations. So we are a forum where anyone that's got a stake in it can help discuss and agree consensually the procedures for the domain name system and for IP addresses. That's what we do. So you use the sort of rule book that's developed by the ICANN community in order to connect with the TCP/IP and connect to other networks to form the internet. Next to us, there's things like the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is where a lot of the internet standards are developed. And there's a few other institutions at that layer. And then, here it's at the bottom, other people have got it on top. That's what people call over the top often, is the content layer or the economic and societal layer. That's really about the uses of the internet, what goes through the pipe, what people do with the information that's on the pipe. And that's really where there's a lot of the issues that we hear about today in digital governance. That's the play, and here the main players are, again, in terms of governance, it's the rules, it's the regulations, but it's also to an extent the public opinion and reputation of the companies involved, which are at play. So that third bottom layer of governance is probably the most difficult to grasp and the one that's subject to the most pressures today. And ICANN, luckily, one of the great things we have, and a lot of the organization at this code or logical layer of digital governance have got, is that it's an open forum. And whether you're a government, you're a digital business, or even if you're an NGO that's got an interest in the domain name system, you can actually take part. We've got various committees which are basically sort of half looking after technical stuff, like the security and stability of the domain name system, about half about the policies, the procedures to do with domain names, and some consumer protection or intellectual property stuff. And all these issues, all these procedures, whether technical or policy, are debated and agreed by all these stakeholders together. Unlike the usual sort of international process where a UN agency would be there and governments would decide, here, in this layer of governance, anyone can play their part as long as they've got an interest. So this is a part of digital governance where every single one of you can actually be active. So if, indeed, many of you are hoping to have digital business in the future and therefore you should care about digital governance, at that level, you can get active. So if you have domain interests, if you have an interest in IP numbers, and a lot of you do, directly or indirectly, it's worth keeping an eye on this, and the advantage is here, you have access. You can take part directly in those discussions on digital governance and negotiate with others to try and ensure that the policies that will shape the DNS in the future will be balanced and will be rooted in reality. Just some examples here. We've got things like right protection mechanism for the DNS, DNSSEC that's been that you might have heard of, which sort of helps against domain hijacking. The expansion of the domain name space with 1,000 new generic TLDs coming on, etc., etc. That's sort of things that are debated. Just a bit of, I was told I wasn't supposed to do any promotion, but it's not a product. Yeah, I should mention, actually, it's all free at ICANN, by the way. It's free to attend, free to take part. Now, our next meeting is next month in Copenhagen. Though most of the discussions are online, so you can follow, you can take part in all the work online and don't need to travel there. It's just nice sometimes, like today, to be in a forum where you can meet people in person. I just want to conclude really with this slide, because really the situation here is, remember, we've got digital governance is not something that anyone involved in digital issues can forget. Increasingly, digital is going to be regulated. there used to be, you still hear it sometimes, people saying, oh, the internet is this new space, it's cyberspace, it's a new environment, it's lawless, or it's the Wild West, depending on who is talking. That's never been true. The internet's always been subject to some kind of rules. You know, we might have been just competition or privacy, just general rules, but it's always been subject to law. What's happening now is that increasingly there's calls for either the introduction of new laws specifically for cyber, for digital stuff, or the beefing up of the existing laws to take into account new technologies, new digital innovations. And if this sector here, the digital sector, where there is the pure digital company or the sort of old companies that are now embracing digital, do not take part in those discussions, do not make their voice heard, either directly in fora like ICANN, where you're welcome to come and visit us in Copenhagen and online, etc. If you don't get involved there, or if you don't make your voice heard with parliamentarians increasingly so, I think you're all going to have problems with your bottom line. It would be a real shame. Thank you.